Far away, in the furthest reaches of space in the northwestern spiral arm of the Milky Way, there evolved a weird and wonderful planet. A planet unlike any other in the known galaxy, and inhabited by all manner of strange creatures. That planet was called Linkit, and was the home of the Robugs. Amiable, friendly little beings, but ones who would not win first prize in any beauty contest. They believed in Yang, the philosophy of the cube. Its endless permutations for construction showed them that whilst there are many answers to the same problem, no one answer is ever the complete solution, if you see what I mean. The Robugs used Yang to design, invent, and build fabulous robots of all shapes and sizes. These robots were used to make space stations, spacecraft, advanced aircraft, and ground vehicles to help the Robugs in their life on the planet. Linkit itself was an interesting place, having all types of landmass. Near Middle Linkit, where most of the Robugs lived and worked, were the vast purple plains, peaceful and restful, ideal for outings, but unfortunately home of the ferocious Stridents, who thought little of having the odd Robug for a tasty breakfast. Past the purple plains were the swamps, dangerous, foul places where slithery creatures waited in the gloom, emerging to attack the unwary traveler. And then there were the dark mountains, towering above the rest of the planet, easy to get lost in and difficult to climb. But on the whole, life was happy enough in Middle Linkit, and although there were good and bad Robugs, they lived together quite peacefully. In fact, it was much too peaceful for one adventurous little Robug called Ricky Linkit. So, with only his personal computer for company, he climbed into his spaceship and blasted off for the stars. Little did Ricky know as he set his ship's coordinates that just after he'd left, strange changes would take place on Linkit which would affect the whole galaxy. Ricky remained blissfully ignorant of any changes until one day, 2 light years later, a Wednesday I think it was, or was it a Tuesday? No, it was definitely a Wednesday. Anyway, on this day, Ricky was cruising around the holiday planet Costadorm, looking for a nice spot to have a picnic, when suddenly he received a peculiar message from the planet Linkit. The message was an invitation to people to come and share the power of the red meteorite and help protect it from attack. What did it all mean? There'd been no meteorite when Ricky had left. It was all very strange. Oh well, there's nothing for it, thought Ricky, but to see if his computer could help him. He hated talking to it because it was always moaning about something or other. And on top of this, it was a right little know-all, absorbing and storing electro-radio waves from all over the galaxy.
Hello, Ricky. Have a nice day. How can I be of service to you?
Ricky asked the computer about the meteorite and what it all meant.
Oh, so you want to know about the meteorite and Linkit? Is that all? I would have told you about it sooner, only I've had so many different things on my mind. And when you're as brilliant as I am, that's an awful lot of things.
This is the strange story the computer told. Just after Ricky had left, a fiery red meteorite had hit the planet Linkit. Fortunately, just missing his brother Arthur, by the way. By coincidence, it landed very close to a robot factory, and a glowing splinter penetrated the factory walls. The robots suddenly began to start acting very strangely indeed, and some of them began to have an evil glint in their eye. It was clear that the meteorite possessed extreme power. It could be used for good or evil, giving greater strength and efficiency to some robots, but also producing evil mutant robots, who began to build their own deadly weapons. Now, certain bad Robugs were quick to seize the advantage and took control of the mutant robots to help them fight the good Robugs so that they could rule Linkit. Thus began an epic struggle for the planet. At first, the bad Robugs and their robots attacked. But the good Robugs fought back and began to win, using the meteorite's power to build strong, efficient robots. The bad Robugs were driven back and back across the purple plain, carefully avoiding the Stridents, of course, across the evil swamps where many mysteriously disappeared, and finally, after much hardship, reached the Dark Mountains. Here, they made their base and started up their own factory, programming their robots to build the most powerful fighting machines ever known. At first, the robots couldn't quite get the hang of it, sticking feet where heads should be, putting on legs back to front, and so on. In fact, the early results looked like real dogs' dinners. Not that any respectable pet would go anywhere near an evil Robug, of course. But eventually, using a book which they found in the library called The Do-It-Yourself Guide to Conquering Planets, the bad robots produced a stream of particularly nasty weapons. There was the all-purpose TerraTrek, a multi-wheeled vehicle heavily armed that could go anywhere on the planet. Well, almost anywhere. As if that wasn't bad enough, they also built the ferocious LK-111 laser ships, with lasers that could pinpoint the tiniest targets. Things weren't looking too good for the good Robugs. Fortunately, however, Ricky Linkit's brother Arthur had been working on the plans for the most powerful weapon yet, the multi-purpose Artillus unit. By working his robots day and night, giving them overtime and an extra oil allowance, he managed to turn out enough Artillus units to move against the bad Robugs. The crucial battle took place on the Purple Plain. It was a truly titanic struggle, where the only pause, apart from a tea break of course, was to rebuild battered forces and reassemble them for the fight. Finally, the bad Robugs had had enough. They waved a little white flag and retreated back to the Dark Mountains to rebuild. The good Robugs celebrated in style, but knew that the bad Robugs and all their devilish allies would be back. Arthur had the brilliant idea of contacting other good races in the universe to share the power of the meteorite and come and help them in their struggle. This message was transmitted into space by way of the brilliant radions, floating space stations that could be controlled from the ground and could also spy on the bad Robugs to see exactly what they were getting up to. Back in Ricky Linkit's spaceship, way out in the far reaches of the galaxy, the computer finished telling Ricky all about these happenings on the planet.
You see, a lot's been happening while you've been gone, Ricky. The message you've just received was sent 1.5 light years ago. I think you ought to go back and see what's happened since. Do you mind if I have a rest now? I've just got to think about the problems of the wobbling jelly people of the planet Triflonia.
Ricky knew that he had no time to lose. He had to get back home to help his brother Arthur and all the other good Robugs in their fight. But a long time had passed. Ricky wondered whether he would be too late. When he returned to the planet, who would have the upper hand? Would it be the bad Robugs or the good Robugs? Had anybody else in space received the message? Would the planet still be there? All these questions rocketed around his Robug brain as he again woke up his grumpy computer and fed it the coordinates for home. As his spacecraft approached Linkit many parsecs later, the first thing that caught Ricky's eye was a giant space station rotating slowly around the planet. This hadn't been there when he'd left, and it clearly hadn't been built by any Robug. It was much too large and complicated for that. Ricky decided to switch on his special invisibility shield that meant he could get close to the space station without being seen. Slowly, he edged towards it, and when within a few hundred meters, turned off the spacecraft's power. He attached himself to his lifeline and floated out into space beside the space station. Crawling over its gleaming surface, he edged his way to a lighted porthole. Peering carefully inside, he was astonished by the sight that greeted him. Strange, pale creatures with weird arms and legs were sitting at a table. They had weird deformities to their claws, 4 long and 1 short stubby protuberance on each. What's more, their bodies were almost totally covered in some sort of cloth material, and their heads seemed to have peculiar stringy stuff sprouting from them. Who were they? They looked harmless enough. Ricky quickly scrambled back to his craft and, once safely inside, switched on his motors and moved slowly away to the far side of the planet. Reluctantly, he switched on his computer. He had to know who these strange creatures were.
Hello, Ricky. Welcome home. We are now orbiting the planet Linkit at 200,000 meters. The weather today in Middle Linkit is overcast, windy, and with the chance of some rain in the afternoon. Tomorrow will be mainly dry, with scattered meteorite showers in the west, so tin hats are recommended. The rest of Linkit will be sunny and warm, with...
Impatiently, Ricky interrupted the computer's weather forecast and asked him about the people on the spacecraft, describing to him in detail their strange appearance and habits.
From your description, which wasn't very good, I have to say, the people you describe are the Tradons, originating from the planet Earth on the southeast spiral arm of the galaxy. It's a very inferior place, parsecs away from the main space routes, and totally inconvenient to get to.
Ricky again interrupted the computer. What he needed to know was whether they were bad or good, simple as that.
No need to be so impatient, Ricky. According to my databanks, which are never wrong, as you well know, they are good creatures. They also have their own form of Yang philosophy, which they call Rubik's Cube. But I digress. They are almost certainly on the side of the good Robugs. Ooh!
Ricky was relieved at this news, switched off his invisibility circuits on the spacecraft, and commenced his descent to the planet, to land near Middle Linkit. Once safely down on Linkit, Ricky opened the hatch, and to his delight, the first Robug he saw was his brother Arthur, still looking a little worse for wear from his close encounter with the meteorite, but in fine shape otherwise. After finding out how his favorite Roball team, Robug United, had done in his absence, not too brilliantly by the way, Ricky went with him to see the Tradons. Arthur told him that the Tradons had arrived just last week and had their headquarters, a futuristic Tradome, nearby. Arthur and Ricky hitched a ride on a robot going in that direction and were soon at the Tradome. Ricky peeped inside, and the first thing he saw was a giant two-legged robot which had a compartment at the top in which a Tradon sat controlling its directions and actions. Ricky was impressed, even more so when he looked to his right and saw an unfamiliar four-legged walking machine, again surmounted by a globe in which a Tradon sat. Unfortunately, while both Tradons were smiling and waving to the two Robugs, they weren't looking where they were going, with unfortunate results. Still, the damage wasn't serious and easily repaired. Ricky was certain that with the help of the Tradons, the bad Robugs could be defeated, and then the planet would be peaceful again. Although he had to admit he quite liked the excitement of the moment. He wouldn't have said this if he could have seen what was happening on the other side of the planet, near the dark mountains, at that very moment. 2 evil spacecraft had landed, and even now, more strange craft and creatures were being unloaded in the gloom. As each trundled out, it was greeted by squeals of delight by the bad Robugs. Where had these unexpected allies come from? And how had they known about the bad Robugs' cause? It was quite simple, really. When the good Robugs had sent out their message into space for help, the Tradons were not the only ones who had heard it. Unfortunately, the message was also picked up by the Cranials, evil conquerors of faraway planets in the galaxy. It happened like this. Just as the Cranial Emperor was deciding whether to use his particle beam accelerator or high fission laser bomb to destroy a nice friendly planet because they'd given him the wrong change when he'd bought a new battery for his electronic newspaper, just as he was deciding, the strange Robug message was received and brought to him. His eyes narrowed and a smile played across his lips. That's because it had nowhere else to play. He would go to the planet Linkit, find out who was attacking the meteorite, join them in capturing it, and get its power for the Cranial Empire. Now, safely on the planet, they were unloading equipment to help the bad Robugs. Four-legged walking machines called astromills, and another equally evil one called a vector. Apart from these very nasty pieces of work, the Cranials could also count on a horde of ferocious agrobot robots who they trained to do their will, and sleek, fast astrojets flown by the Cranials. Meanwhile, the evil Cranial Emperor and the bad Robug Chief sat down and planned their campaign against the good Robugs. Would they attack that night, or wait until they built more robots? How would the good Robugs and the space people defend themselves? What about the space people's orbiting space station? What role will Ricky and Arthur play in the events to come? Things then were poised on a knife edge on the planet Linkit, as the evil Cranial Emperor and the leader of the bad Robugs, known to his friends as Attila, I won't tell you what his enemies called him, sat down and discussed strategy over a delicious stew made from a strident that the bad robots had managed to catch that morning. Delicious, that is, if you like the taste of stewed shoe leather, which they clearly did. We left them, if you remember, in part 1, discussing when to attack the good Robugs. The bad guys had a basic problem. Their supply of meteorite power was fast running out. In order to build more robots and weapons for an out-and-out assault on Middle Linkit, they had to have more pieces of meteorite. And there was only one way to get them: a raid on the red meteorite supply in Middle Linkit. To do that, however, they needed more information. How heavily guarded was the meteorite? Would it be possible to attack it after dark? And what weapons should they use? As they finished their stew, they decided to send out an LK-111 laser ship early the next morning on a low-level mission to photograph the red meteorite and bring back the pictures so they could plan their next evil move. Early the next morning, as the twin suns of Linkit rose into the pink sky, a powerful LK-111 also rose from its launch pad and headed, skimming the ground, for Middle Linkit. As luck would have it, the good Robugs had been celebrating Ricky Linkit's return the night before and were feeling, not to put too fine a point on it, slightly fragile. In fact, it can't be denied that the Robug in charge of the Radion lookout stations was fast asleep. And while all around him in the control tower, the TV screen showed clearly the approaching LK-111, nobody was alerted or took any notice at all. The LK-111 skimmed over the good Robug defenses, heading deeper into Middle Linkit. There ahead of it was the red meteorite, glowing in the warm morning air. and all around it were piles of meteorite rock that had been chipped off the old block, ready to be used to power the good Robugs robots. The LK-111 swooped down and started its cameras recording the main compound which the meteorite was in, noting the 6-foot-high electrified fence all round it, seeing the Robug lookout towers full of, yes, you guessed it, sleeping good Robugs, sleeping good. After it had used up all its film, the LK-111 fired its boosters, shot up vertically into the sky, and applied maximum thrust as it sped back to the Dark Mountains. Now this noise, you'll be relieved to hear, did actually wake up the sleeping Robug in the control tower, who looked at his TV screens to see the LK-111 vanishing into the distance. Realizing that he'd been asleep on duty, he blushed bright green and instantly called Arthur on his phone to tell him of the intruder. It was too late. Studying the pictures, the Cranial Emperor hit on a plan. What they needed was a commando raid on the meteorite, and they needed fast transport to get enough meteorite blocks away from the compound. They assembled their forces. The TerraTrek was ideal. It could hold sufficient meteorite pieces to keep their forces in power for years to come. The Vectors would carry the Cranial Commandos, and as support, they would use the ferocious Agrobots. All was set for the attack, and extremely fiendish it was. 2 nights later, as the sun set and the night creatures of Linkit woke up, down from the Dark Mountains rumbled the bad Robug force. At last they reached the meteorite, and here they put their plan into action. The nasty Agrobots mounted a diversionary attack on the far side of the meteorite compound. Immediately, all the good Robugs, robots, and Tradons rushed to that side, and a dramatic battle began. This left one side of the compound totally clear, and the Cranial Commandos, with their new high-powered but very quiet lasers, took up the fence. The TerraTrek moved through, and instantly the Cranials started loading the meteorite blocks. Once finished, the Commandos clambered back into their Vectors, and the TerraTrek, now fully loaded, trundled out of the compound, slowly building up speed. At that point, one good Robug noticed them and raised the alarm. The pursuit was on. But under the cover of darkness, the Cranials and bad Robugs made good their escape. Back across the swamps, over the purple plains, and back into the Dark Mountains. Many of the Robugs had been left behind in pieces, but had succeeded in their task. They'd got their valuable supply of red meteorite. The evil Cranial Emperor did a little jig in celebration. Things, however, were totally different back in Middle Linkit. Everybody was very, very depressed. Although they'd beaten off the Agrobots, they knew that the Cranials and bad Robugs had won a considerable victory. Ricky and Arthur Linkit called a top-level meeting with the space people to decide what to do next. Clearly, their defenses had to be sharpened up. All leave was cancelled. Production at the robot factory was stepped up. Everything was put in gear for an enormous effort. The Radion floating spy stations were reinforced, so that an attack could never take place again. Or so they hoped. A few days later, Arthur and Ricky were having a well-deserved break, when Ricky had a brainwave. Why not, he said, play the bad Robugs and evil Cranials at their own foul game? Before they could build up their forces of weapons and robots, why not mount their own surprise attack on the Dark Mountains to retrieve the meteorite pieces? Arthur didn't think much of this idea. For a start, the Dark Mountains were fairly dangerous. Narrow passages and deep gorges were ideal for surprise attacks by the bad Robugs. Cloud covered the Dark Mountain peaks, making them impenetrable even to the high-floating Radions and the orbiting Tradon space station. Ricky, however, was prepared for this. When he was a very young Robug, and the planet was extremely peaceful, he used to go camping in the foothills of the mountains, so he knew the area quite well. He explained his plan to Arthur, who hated to admit it, but was quite impressed. Ricky's plan involved his trusty spaceship. The next morning, when all the arrangements had been made, he boarded the craft. It smelt a bit musty, though, so he switched on the air conditioning. And then his computer.
Oh, so there you are. I don't know. I take you all around the galaxy and tell you everything you want to know, but what happens when you get home? I'll tell you nothing. You don't call me, you don't come to see how I am. I could be dead for all you care. It's enough to make my circuits sick.
This sort of comment was quite normal for Ricky's computer, so Ricky ignored it. Checking the equipment, he prepared for blastoff, and he was away. Once in orbit, he reprogrammed the computer.
So, you want to go somewhere else now, do you? There's no set-asides on Robugs. Okay, east side of the Dark Mountains. Excuse me. Do you know that's an extremely dangerous place? Far be it from me to remind you, but it is inhabited by the cranials and bad Robugs at the moment.
Ricky overrode these objections and set course. His plan was to approach the Dark Mountains from the far side to Middle Linkit, close to the deep green sea. Here, the mountains came right down to the seashore. It was extremely unlikely that any good Robug attack would come from this quarter, so it was likely to be very poorly guarded, if at all. If he was right, he stood a chance of success. If he was wrong, then he could be in real trouble. Ricky's spacecraft gently set down on the seashore. The sun beat down on his Robug head, and for a moment it was just like the peaceful old days he'd loved so much as a little Robugette. But there was work to be done. Carefully, he camouflaged his spacecraft, and then did something very strange. He took out his picnic basket and started up the Dark Mountains. Not, I think you'll agree, the best place for a leisurely lunch. As quickly and as carefully as possible, Ricky Linkit climbed into the heart of the Dark Mountains, occasionally looking at his electronic direction finder. As night fell, he stopped in a little hollow and made himself his evening snack. Baked beans on toast, a Robug delicacy. Then he fell asleep by his tiny campfire and dreamed sweetly of times past. It was a dream that had a very abrupt awakening, administered by a giant cranial boot. Ricky started awake and looked up into the vile features of a cranial soldier, enough to give any self-respecting inhabitant of the galaxy nightmares for life. Ricky stood up and was made to follow the cranial. As dawn broke, Ricky shivered at the desolation all around him. Suddenly, there in the distance was a sight to make his Robug blood run cold. A vast encampment of dwellings, scurrying robots, awesome war machines, all surmounted by a huge craniodome, above which floated the flag of the Cranial Empire. This must be the center of the bad Robug encampment. Ricky's thoughts were interrupted by a dig in his ribs. He continued on his way and finally stopped outside the Cranial Emperor's home. Ricky was pushed inside and came face to face with the horrible Emperor and Attila the Robug. Ricky knew he was in trouble as Attila approached him with an evil glint in his eye. Ricky's Robug legs shook and he prepared for the worst. How would he get out of this? Would rescue come in time? The situation looked hopeless. All, however, was not lost. Still clutched in Ricky's sweaty Robug claw was his picnic basket. Innocent enough, you might think, but absolutely vital to the plot of this story. You see, shortly before Ricky had blasted off in his spaceship, a small but heavily armed and highly trained group of Tradons and good Robugs had slipped away from Middle Linkit under the cover of darkness. Led by Ricky's brother Arthur, their aim was to get to the near side of the Dark Mountains without being detected by the bad Robugs or the Cranials. To help them, they took along one of their powerful Artillus units, plus, of course, a squadron of good Robugs, robots and Tradons. By day, they camouflaged their forces and rested, as the bad Robugs' ferocious LK-111s made numerous flights, but failed to detect them. Everything to the bad Robugs looked good, if you follow my meaning. Anyway, that night, Arthur's good Robug forces set out again, crossing the Purple Plain, navigating the swamps, and finally coming to rest at the foot of the Dark Mountains, where they made camp. After having eaten, baked beans on toast of course, Arthur took out his own picnic basket, very like the one carried by Ricky. He opened it up, and inside was an ingenious device. It had a rough map drawn on it with 2 yellow blips that at the moment were stationary at opposite corners. The furthest blip was in fact Ricky's location, because in Ricky's picnic basket was a special homing device which was broadcasting Ricky's exact position. The idea was simple and very carefully planned. You see, Ricky had intended to get captured. Taking with him his picnic basket meant that his position could be accurately tracked by Arthur and his forces. As Ricky was captured, the blip on the screen started to move across the surface of the Dark Mountains, and so Arthur and his forces plotted their route to head in the same direction as Ricky. As dawn broke, they had to hide, but by then Ricky's blip had stopped moving. He was at this moment in the home of Attila the Robug, who was getting extremely annoyed with him. What Attila wanted to know was how Ricky had got to the Dark Mountains. It was, after all, a long way to walk by anyone's reckoning. Had anybody else come with him? Ricky told him he'd arrived by spaceship, but couldn't quite remember at the time exactly where he parked it. Getting impatient with Ricky, Attila ordered the Robug guards to take him away until he decided to talk. He was marched to a small cabin on the edge of the camp. Ricky was thrown in and the door slammed behind him. It was, despite the daylight, fairly dark in the cabin, and Ricky made himself as comfortable as possible to wait for Arthur's hoped-for rescue mission. As he had had a tiring day so far, he soon fell fast asleep. As it began to get dark that evening, Ricky woke up to hear Robug voices outside his door. He was just about to call out, thinking that it might be Arthur, when he realized they were bad Robugs. What they were saying was very interesting indeed. It seemed that the meteorite blocks which the bad Robugs and cranials had stolen were being kept in a cave just a short distance away. It was awaiting transportation to a robot factory deeper in the Dark Mountains. And that transportation was to take place tomorrow morning. Where was Arthur, thought Ricky? He was never on time for anything. The sound of Robug voices outside his door suddenly stopped, or to be more exact, were stopped. The door was broken down, and there stood Arthur and the Tradons. Ricky quickly explained about the cave and the meteorite. They had to move quickly. The Artillus unit, specially silenced, was brought into action, and they approached the cave. It wasn't too heavily guarded, and the cranials were taken by surprise. Quickly, Ricky, Arthur, the good Robugs and robots started to load the meteorite blocks onto the Artillus unit, and slipped away under the cover of night, back down the mountains, across the swamp, and across the Purple Plains to Middle Linkit. They'd won a great victory, but it was only the first step in the struggle for the planet Linkit.